Hello and welcome to episode number 3 of the Define and Conquer podcast, which is part of the European Health Psychology Society and its special interest group on formalization, conceptualization and measurement. I'm Christoph Bamberg from the University of Salzburg.
Olga Persky from Stockholm University.
And today we have 2 guests, so that's something new for us. And we're very excited to have Maya and Yong joining us for this episode today, which will focus on the measurement of time-varying constructs. Yeah. To start, maybe you want to introduce yourself. How about you, Maya?
Yes. Hi, Christoph and Olga. My name is, and listeners, my name is Maya Braun. I'm from Germany. Originally, I did my bachelor's at the Ruhr-Universität in Bochum. And then I moved to Belgium, where I'm still now. So I did my master's in clinical psychology and also statistical data analysis at Ghent University, and also my PhD at Ghent University. And in my PhD, I focused on personalized physical activity recommendations that go beyond this 10,000 steps a day idea. But then we quickly noticed during the PhD that it's pretty hard to make these personalized recommendations if we don't just want to use an AI tool or throw machine learning at things, if we really want to understand the recommendations. So we first kind of needed to try to understand the behavior. And not only what kind of activities do we want, but also what kind of barriers have people facing and under which circumstances. And that's how I ended up in this time-varying construct measurement.
Yeah, sounds interesting. And I like this thing with the 10,000 steps, this recommendation. I sometimes use this in teaching also to tell people that not everything you hear is always based on science. So what is the recommendation then? Just to briefly summarize it. It's complicated.
I mean, there's different recommendations for physical activity. I think in the end, at least in Belgium, we really use this every step counts approach, where moving a little bit more is always better than moving a little bit less. And we definitely shouldn't tell people that if they can't reach 10,000 steps, their efforts are worthless. But I mean, there are like World Health Organization recommendations for physical activity also that are 150 minutes of moderate intensity activity a week and 2 sessions of strength and balance training a week. So if you're looking to follow those, they also exist.
Okay, I will look that up later. Thanks for the recommendation. Yeah, thanks for the introduction. And how about you, Yong?
Okay, hi everyone. So my name is Yong, and I am now doing my PhD in the Netherlands, University of Groningen, in methodology and statistics. So my research mostly focused on time series analysis, but even more important for me is the methodology part of the experience sampling studies. How can we better design the study to ensure that the quality of the data that we get is high enough to conduct reasonable analysis? So this for me is the most important thing to work on for now. So before this, I had quite a long journey. I started as a bachelor in both international politics and psychology. And at the time, I was working in a lab that focused on psychology of aging. So as you grow older, what becomes a bit different and how can we better protect the well-being of older adults, basically. And after that, I went to University of Southern California, so that was in Los Angeles, for a master in gerontology, so basically the study of aging. There, I continued research in this field, but moved more into the neuropsychology part, where I learned how to operate the MRI and scan beautiful brains of people. Yeah, but still, I feel like that didn't click so well with me. And also, I've always had a strong interest in methodology about how to do research in the right way. So I was reading a lot of papers and particularly got really interested in the work of Laura Brinkmann, who is a professor now in Groningen. So I just pursued this interest and moved to Groningen for another master. And eventually now I am staying here for the PhD, working with Laura as my supervisor.
Yeah, it's always nice if you can just follow your interests. And yeah, that's very cool. Master in gerontology, that sounds also very exciting.
Yeah, because from this master is still very different from what I do now, but it's really nice to see that the issue of aging and then to ensure older adults' well-being and their good life quality in the whole society, there are so many different aspects to consider. And it also gives me some inspirations for now. When I design my study, whatever the topic is, it's important to always feel what the participants feel about your study, right? So I think that's quite essential for a methodologist, especially in psychology.
Yeah. And Young, so the types of populations or kind of problems that you focus now with this methodology lens, does it relate to your background in gerontology, or have you kind of shifted to very different
So
populations?
yeah, for now, not necessarily, because I'm more focused on the methodology side, of course. And then I, of course, always look forward to having something that I worked on being applied in any clinical or organizational, whatever setting, or health psychology. Apparently, I'm not a health psychologist, but if what I work on is somehow helpful for research in this field, then I'm always very happy. So not limiting myself, just try to see where it works the best.
Yeah, and we definitely need more methodologists in psychology, I think. So great. So we're very excited that you joined us today, because our past episodes, we've talked to a few guests already, kind of setting the scene for issues around conceptualization and measurements of psychological concepts. And today, as we already mentioned, we'll focus specifically on how we can think about capturing time-varying constructs in psychology. So these are things that fluctuate dynamically within individuals over time, right? So I was wondering if maybe Maya, do you want to start by giving some background to why we should pay attention to time-varying constructs?
Yeah, of course. So I guess the starting point for most of what we do in research, and especially in psychology, is what we call cross-sectional research. So that's often one big survey, for example, or one-time measurement occasion. For us, it's usually surveys, where we ask people a bunch of things, and then we look at how things are associated with each other. And for some kinds of research questions, this makes sense. But for quite a lot of things, it also doesn't make a lot of sense. And yeah, the things that we want to look at in health psychology or in psychology more generally are often time varying, like you said, Olga, which means that they fluctuate throughout time, can be from day to day, can be from minute to minute, can be any kind of time varying. So for example, if we look at health behaviors like physical activity, of course, just because someone is more at, like, for example, the 10,000 steps, right? If someone sets 10,000 steps on most days, doesn't mean that they're always taking steps at any moment of the day, right? It only means on average throughout their life. That's kind of their activity level. But that's not all we want to know. We want to understand these fluctuations throughout the day, throughout the week, sometimes even within the hour, depending on the behavior. And we can't do that with this cross-sectional research. So we really need to ask, or at least collect data multiple times a day in some instances.
Yeah, and do you have any examples? So you mentioned some health behaviors like physical activity. But can you give some examples of other things that we already know from the research we have available that they also kind of fluctuate?
Yeah, I mean, in my lab here at Ghent University, a lot of my colleagues work with chronic pain patients, and we know that their symptoms, fatigue, pain, things like that, fluctuate very strongly throughout the day. And typically, chronic pain patients, they have days that are worse and days that are better, but they also have parts of the day that are worse and better. So that's really important to know to help them also, for example, create a routine that works better for them. It's important to understand which moments of the day are best for that individual. Things like that.
Great. Also, there is this notion of non-urbanicity. Young, maybe you want to touch on that a bit and why we should care about it.
Yeah, so I think usually in this field, a simpler term that we call this is the within-between problem. So the classic example is between typing speed and the mistakes one makes, right? So you can imagine on average, people who type faster are more proficient in typing, and in the long run, they will make fewer mistakes. But if you think about it within person, for everyone, if you ask them to type faster and faster and faster, they will gradually make more and more and more mistakes. So in this example, you see a clear difference about this relationship between the two variables on the between person level and the within person level. This just means that sometimes in psychology, most of the time we are interested in the mechanisms which is supposed to be within person level. But historically, we are more used to conducting research on the between person level and take it sort of for granted that this results on the between person level will naturally also translate to the same thing on the within person level, which is of course not necessarily the thing. So that's why in order to better understand the mechanism, probably better to do research also on the within person level, which would require some time series data.
And that's a little bit like the Simpsons paradox as well, right? What you just described. Basically,
Exactly.
just a different name for it. Interesting. Just spontaneously. So if we want to learn about the mechanisms, yeah, we should look more at the individual. But what if we are more interested in like an epidemiological perspective? Can we then not just do cross-sectional studies, or should we still focus more on longitudinal data as well? So if we want to learn how it is for the population overall and not necessarily care about the mechanism.
Well, there is still some in-between options, right? For example, these days, what we call panel data or cohort data. So they could still be based on a large group of people, but instead of asking them once, you have a few times of follow-up. And with this type of data, you sort of strike a balance between a large number of people, but also a few times to see potential changes and what is related to these changes among people. So if, like you said, the epidemiological research, maybe the panel data could be a handy thing to work with.
Right. So it depends on the question that we are interested in, as usual, I guess.
Yeah, it depends.
Yeah.
And to make it more complicated, I suppose we could also incorporate some measurement bursts designs within that. But I think we haven't yet defined really what the type of measurement is that we are talking about. So, Christopher, I'll hand over to you to sort of take us to the next level.
So maybe the next question would be what we typically do in longitudinal research to handle this issue with time varying constructs.
Yeah, I mean, one option, if they're not varying on a very, very small level, then you can, of course, just ask a couple of times, like Jon was just mentioning. But what we often do with things like fatigue, like pain, that we think will vary a lot, even on the small scale, is what we call ecological momentary assessment, in short EMA, or sometimes also experience sampling method. It's kind of used interchangeably. And what we do there is we, instead of inviting people over into the lab, we give them something, usually an app on their smartphone nowadays, where they can fill in questions multiple times a day. So this nowadays it's usually done on a smartphone, but in older papers, sometimes you see like a personal device that they get, or just a diary even, where they write it down. But nowadays, usually a smartphone app or even a wearable. And there, we basically ask them multiple times throughout the day, usually, to fill in quite short questionnaires. And then, based on this information, we can try to understand how their constructs vary within the day, within that person. And how often you ask again, of course, depends on your construct of interest and also on the research question you're asking. But some of them are very, very intense and really ask very, very often throughout the day.
Right. But are we limited to self-report in this kind of research?
Not necessarily. You can collect all kinds of passive data as well. So I often do physical activity stuff. So then I usually have some kind of fitness tracker or accelerometer that people are wearing. And then I have that activity data as well. And you can have smartphone-based data as well, all kinds of stuff. You could even get like the GPS from their smartphone. It really depends on your research question. But anything your device can know, you can theoretically, once you get the ethics approval, take into your research.
Right, and that's always a challenge. Right, yeah. I think this new approach then to kind of use smartphones and sensors and so on to have many measurements, how does it compare to the classical approach with standardized questionnaires? What we learned from these new approaches with EMA, what does it tell us about how like traditional questionnaires, how they fare against that? Given what you explained, that our constructs might vary over time, what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, it's very tricky to basically in EMA, we usually want to have very short questionnaires because we don't want to give people 50 items 6 times a day. So we can't really reuse these long questionnaires that have been standardized and validated for research. But also, yeah, a lot of these validation techniques rely on stability of the construct. So for example, we have this thing called test-retest reliability, where we check basically at 2 time points. If we measure this thing again, do we get the same result? If we do, we see that as a good sign that this test is stable. But of course, if we now think that the construct we're looking at is not stable and should be varying, then it's always giving the same result might even be a bad sign. It might show this actually is very insensitive to change. So it does kind of call these more traditional validation techniques into question.
Because they are more designed for constructs that are constant, right? And they don't work with time varying constructs in a way.
Yeah, I mean, at least that's at the basis of the validation technique. I'm not sure if they're always applied that way, but that's the idea.
Yeah. All right.
But there are some advances in this area, right? With kind of not necessarily new methods, maybe, but kind of extensions of methods to time varying constructs. You
Yeah, definitely.
you read a bit about that? Do you know about that?
Yeah, so in my research group, there is a postdoc researcher called Sebastian Castro Alvarez. He recently published a paper in Psychological Methods, providing an overview of current approaches to calculate reliability in the time series, or what we call intensive longitudinal data. So there are quite diverse approaches, and given what Maya just mentioned, it is quite a complicated thing to do compared to the cross-sectional data. So currently, the research using these methods don't always check reliability or report anything on it. But, well, he hopes this paper would provide a good starting point for researchers to rely on. And then a lot of the approaches, as you mentioned, Olga, are starting from simply expanding based on the factor analysis that we are used to doing on the cross-sectional data. For example, it's just a bunch of approaches are related to dynamic factor analysis, which is really just one additional thing based on the factor analysis, which is that you assume that between time points, the same construct could have carryover effect. So this is the only key difference between the dynamic and the what we call static factor analysis. And a lot of the reliability calculation is based on this.
So something that I find interesting about this as well, I don't know too much kind of the details of all of these different methods, but if I understand correctly, a lot of them also kind of depend on latent variable models are kind of having multiple items assessing the same construct, which I suppose isn't always what we do in external sampling research. We use a lot of single items.
Yeah, exactly. To minimize the participants' burden, indeed, a lot of the times to measure the same construct, we would just use a very small number of items. And then that also leads to some difficulties in calculating reliability. So this reminds me of another paper that actually did similar things, but Icebound Lehrtauer has a preprint on this. And what I find really interesting and nice about this paper is that he develops the paper based on the number of items per construct you have, and then provide separate recommendations on how you can calculate reliability for different measurement and research scenarios. So that's also a nice reference to look at if you are interested in the reliability issue.
Could you give us an example of some of the things that are recommended in this paper?
So I am not the absolute expert in this field, but I think it was, in a sense, nice that it summarizes a lot of approaches that people have proposed, but do not necessarily agree with all of them and critically reflect on them. So, for example, there is a researcher from KU Leuven in Belgium, Braun de Yong Zhang. He did propose the using test-retest reliability also in the EMA setting. For example, in the same beep, at the beginning you ask, for example, how happy you are now. And at the end, unexpectedly, you ask it again and see how similar these two scores are, right? I guess. But this is, of course, having its own assumption that within this one beep, your happiness level should stay the same, which might not be the case, right? If you are a participant that's getting really, really annoyed by filling out this long questionnaire, then your happiness level at the beginning of the beep versus at the end of the beep might be reasonably different, right? Then it is hard to quantify reliability based on this. So there are a lot of critiques for different approaches, which I find really nice and inspiring.
Yeah, but it's a fun idea. But I guess you couldn't do that for 4 weeks, 8 signals per day to ask the same thing several times.
Exactly.
But I think they suggest to only do it sometimes and ask a different item, to repeat different items throughout. But it does also bring some additional difficulties, of course, because this also means that we can't just take the data sets that we already have and validate them based on these new techniques necessarily, because we do often need different research designs to validate these questionnaires. And this becomes quite a challenge because a lot of people need very, very highly specific questions for their EMA studies. So if each time you first have to run a validation EMA, which is an intensive study to run and requires quite some resources, this does eat up a lot of your project budget in some cases. But of course, you then get better research.
Sometimes it feels like half of the EMA research is done to validate EMA research in itself, right? But it's a young field, right? So maybe at some point we will have some tried and tested approaches that we then can just apply. And I guess one thing that is also being looked at a lot in EMA is missingness, right? Because that's just a big issue if you give people an app to report in their daily life with, then there's just a lot going on, and there are many reasons why they might not respond. And our classical conceptions of missingness, like this missing at random, missing completely at random, I guess it might also not work so well with EMA, then just like our classical validation approaches don't work so well. Do you have anything to say on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say, I think, on that. But yeah, I mean, the base is that most things in EMA will not be missing completely at random, and probably also not at random at all. For example, we collected data from chronic pain patients, and the data was on pain and fatigue. And of course, if they are having a huge amount of pain or they are very, very tired, this influences whether they fill in the app or not. If they're currently taking a nap or they have a migraine attack and they put their phone away, they will not fill in the questions. And this means that these standard techniques that we've been using, which is really the absence of dealing with things, like list-wise deletion, only using complete cases, which is what I would argue most people still do, really just assumes that this missingness is completely at random and is quite unsuited really for this kind of data. And I think it's true for most EMA data that missingness is not at random.
But at least in the EMA papers that I read, I feel like it's not treated enough, probably. So maybe even if we don't have the perfect way to deal with it yet, at least we should report it more thoroughly, right? Are there any recommendations on that? How to report this better, or?
Well, this is actually the topic that brought me and Maya together, the missing data. This is exactly what I'm trying to work on now. It, of course, started with my own frustration and how I don't know how to handle missing data well in the time series analysis. So I'm trying to, from the perspective of getting the missing data back, trying to improve our research practice in the daily life research a bit. So I give a online talk once on this, and Maya was there in the audience, and Maya later on reached out to me and said, hey, we had this interview data actually after the study. And then one of the questions people got asked during the interview is that if you didn't react or didn't enter your physical activity during this study for some parts, could you tell us why? And I found this a really nice question. And a similar study conducted in Tilburg University also had a similar question, asking people if they missed some beeps, what were the reasons? And I am lucky enough to collaborate with both teams and did some analysis on the interview data actually. And the results are really beautiful to me because they're all interview data, textual data, so completely qualitative, very different from what I'm used to, but I really enjoy the process of working on it. And then something that's really interesting to me is that people really told you sometimes they just did not want to respond. And then this could also be for different reasons. Sometimes it's because it's weekends, so they're not in the mood of doing this for you. Sometimes it's because they are so overwhelmed, so sad, so stressed in life that they don't want to do this. And there are also situations when they are simply just busy and busy with different things, with working, with driving, with cycling, if you're in the Netherlands. Yeah. And there are also very common thing is sleep related. So sometimes people set up the whole EMA schedule at the beginning of the study based on their regular daytime routine. But of course, people oversleep, or some days they go to bed early, and then a lot of people miss beeps actually simply because of this. So all of these tell us that there are something systematically we as designers of the EMA studies are not doing enough, but should work further on to, in a sense, ensure a better experience of the participants in the study, but also try to accommodate these potential irregular things in their life so that we can still collect data even when these things occur.
So interesting. Because also just added on to Maya, what you mentioned about kind of the most common approaches of dealing with missingness and kind of list-wise deletion, because I've also read quite a lot that people try to extend methods that are used in kind of cross-sectional research to experience sampling data and use multiple imputation, for example. But it sounds like, based on your findings here, that it may not be so great to use even these kind of model-based approaches to handle missingness, but that we also need to dig further into other aspects.
Yeah, I agree. I think for multiple imputation, usually it is based on a so-called imputation model, which is something that the researcher has to define, right? In a sense, what predicts missingness, what is related to the missing value. And a lot of these are based on just what you have with available data. But what I find interesting with the EMA research is that as the researcher, you are quite in this period of participation in constant contact with your participants. So you have the opportunity to actually, when they miss a beep, immediately follow up and try to get the missing data back instead of having to make all the guesses at the end, right? So this is the thing that I'm trying to implement in my ongoing study, that to try to test out this methodology. When a participant missed a beep, in the next beep, we ask immediately the reason for missing this and potentially the value of the variable that you're most interested in, to see if we can, in a sense, get the missing data back in a not so burdensome way to facilitate better analysis of the EMA data.
I think even if we try to use these multiple imputation techniques, like Yong was saying, if we don't understand why the data is missing, it can become really tricky. I actually tried to do this in my master thesis for my statistical data analysis master, and we used list-wise deletion, less observation carried forward, which was a bit of a wild thing to try in EMA data. So what you do there is basically you just take the last observation. So if you have an observation at 8 a.m. and one at 10, and they missed the one at 10, you take the data from 8 a.m. and you just reuse it for 10 a.m. Under the assumption that it's likely to be relatively similar, which of course, arguably, is not the best assumption to make here. And then I also tried this multiple imputation that was already mentioned by Olga and Yong. And it was really, really challenging because, first of all, multiple imputation already is challenging to do in general, especially in a multi-level data, right? This data is not independent of each other. It's clustered within people and within days. But then, yeah, you also just basically gamble on the missingness mechanisms. And we used a non-parametric approach then, some kind of machine learning approach to impute the data. But I at least didn't really super trust the results I got there. And they were quite different between the three different approaches though. So if you don't trust either any of these three approaches, which I really didn't, then what does that mean for kind of the results of the EMA data that's out there currently?
So maybe the main thing you can learn from the missing data is then how to design your study a little bit better next time.
I have high
Yeah.
hopes for Yong's study.
But it also
Absolutely.
sounds quite complex and complicated to then ask them about what they missed to report, especially if you're interested in momentary things, right? Because if you then answer it 2 hours later, how did you feel in the moment? Then it's different than answering it right in the moment, right? And then how do you bring those two different kinds of answering the same construct? How do you combine that again?
Exactly. This is also what we are worried about now and are trying to test to see if there could be sort of this so-called recall bias, right? So if you ask people to recall how happy they were 3 hours ago as a secondary best option of getting the data, but are they really accurate? Are they systematically biased? So in our study, we will also test this in a sense that randomly, even if you did not miss the previous beep, at the next beep, sometimes you get the question. If you were to recall how happy you were at the last beep, could you tell us the value? And at the end, we can, of course, compare the momentary report with the later recall report to see if how large is the error on average, and in a sense, is there a certain type of bias, so that we can also better evaluate this general approach, the feasibility, and also see if we need to do something more than simply relying on this later recall value.
That sounds like a very smart approach. So, I mean, we talked now about issues of reliability and missingness, but just to kind of dig even deeper, I guess we haven't yet touched on the issue of construct validity when it comes to these time-varying constructs. And well, we did have a whole episode with G.J. Peters on, really digging into issues with construct validity in general. But I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on how to think about this when it comes to EMA items.
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to even think about some of these constructs that we try to translate to momentary constructs. Because, for example, we measure intention to be physically active, and when we measure it in a cross-sectional study, we ask them about their general intentions to be physically active. But when we ask them in a EMA study 5 times a day, we really ask them, are you intending to be active in the next 2 hours? And then it's really more becomes about the plan to be active rather than the construct intention. So not all constructs, I think, translate so well to this very small timescale, or at least if they translate, we need to really think very thoroughly not only what we are asking, but also what people will be answering. And an additional challenge here is the different contexts in which people are filling in these questionnaires. So the idea of EMA is ecological, which means kind of in the real world, outside of the lab, which is great because then we're really studying the real life of people. But it also is very messy because people's lives are very messy. So one of the things that influences how you answer the questions is where you are. If I get the question about how tired I am and I'm at work and all my colleagues next to me are kind of similarly sluggish as me, then compared to my colleagues, I might feel very regular, very normal, and I put a 3 out of 5 tired. But then if I'm at a child's birthday party and all the children are like on a bouncy castle or something and very active, then compared to them, I might feel insanely tired. So I would answer, even though my inner feeling might be very similar, I would answer very, very differently. And this is a social comparison, but of course there's 1,000 different factors that would influence how you feel and how you would answer. And these factors might not be what we're really interested in EMA always, but in some circumstances it might also be what we're interested in. So it becomes very tricky to differentiate between the construct and the context, and to really understand what are the response processes here.
Exactly. Sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
So I think the response process is really a key word for this in understanding the validity of EMA measurements. So one project now that I am involved in, the one that I mentioned earlier, conducted in Tilburg University, led by Dominik Maciuski and Leonie Schorleb, they actively investigate this using some thinking out loud approach for participants to actively report. For example, you just said you are 5 out of 10 happy. Can you elaborate on how you arrive at this number? And then based on this kind of text data, we are actively coding them, putting them into different categories to see if there are some general approaches on how people tend to approach these at least daily affect items. And so far what we see is that people are quite different in how they understand and respond to the same item, the items that we consider very straightforward, just emotion. And also people can change within themselves over time in how they understand and perceive the same item, which is really fascinating for me, right? Because sometimes, and this is the difficulty about really digging out changes in time series. Sometimes we see things change, seems to be different over time within the same person, but is it meaningful changes, or as we just mentioned, it's simply an artifact because they perceived the item slightly differently in the beginning and versus in the end of the study. Yeah, so it sounds a bit dark, but I would say the same problems, of course, also exist in cross-sectional research, right? And now we are just trying to see how big of a problem this is, and also in a sense, based on what we find, try to see how we can better improve the measurement practice in the experience sampling world, of course.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, that aren't these all problems that also apply to kind of standard questionnaires that are used in other types of research? But it's just maybe that the ecological momentary assessment community is a very methods heavy community, and maybe that's why we're all kind of digging into these issues. Or what do you think?
I think some of the problems also become more apparent because we ask the same people so often. I think many people, at least we always do it, we always talk to our participants afterwards in a short exit interview. And I think many people who do EMA do this kind of stuff. And then you get very concrete feedback like, oh, I didn't know what to do with that question. While if you do a cross-sectional study, everyone just fills in the questionnaire once. You never hear from these people again, typically. You just see the data on your screen, and you don't get this kind of feedback. So I think we also just have, because we have so much interaction with our participants, typically, we do get a bit more info from them, ideally, which is, of course, great to improve our methods, but can be sometimes a bit discouraging because we think we were being very, very clear. And it turns out we weren't. In the interviews that Yong mentioned earlier, we had one, for example, some participants that later on told us, oh yeah, at some point I just stopped filling in the questionnaires during the day and I just filled it all in the evening. Well, that's just not the point. So sometimes these interactions with the participants, of course, they're super important to know what has been going on, but they can be also confrontational.
And do you use qualitative interviews for this, or specific questions that they then fill in one by one?
We do semi-structured interviews. So it is an in-person interview typically, which is nice to get the touch with the participants. But I think open questions could work to some extent. But in my experience, people are somewhat lazy in filling out open text questions, while if you're already there and you're having a coffee with them or something, they tend to talk a lot more.
Right, and then you use the information you get to better design your next study, right? The whole time I was kind of thinking maybe in a Bayesian approach, you could also use this to inform your priors a little bit. But I think it would also get kind of complicated to translate the interview answers into numbers again. But I mean, that's what you need to do with priors anyways, translate your knowledge into numbers. But I think maybe a Bayesian approach might be interesting to combine this very numerical EMA with the more qualitative feedback that participants give afterwards. But I'm also a little bit biased towards Bayesian statistics, so maybe there are also other approaches to do that. And if you only learn something for your next study, then that's already very nice as well, right? So it's definitely a good idea to have those exit interviews.
Just to say as well that we will have a whole episode on Bayesian influence as well in this podcast. Stay tuned to that.
Exciting.
So I know we said that we maybe ended up on a slightly sort of a dark path here. So I was wondering, so for our listeners who are interested in using these approaches in their work, do you have any tips for them on how they can overcome some of these issues that we've been talking about?
I think one of the main things that we do is we don't only talk to our participants afterwards, which is also important, but we also talk to our participants before. So first, before we kind of gather questions onto all of the participants, we do some piloting interviews where we do this kind of think aloud approach that Jong also already talked about. And we really try to make sure that all the questions are as clear as possible. And we try to get them as good as we can without personalizing them to everyone yet. That's a dream maybe in the future, but not yet. And then we also, with each participant that actually takes part in the EMA study, we also go through all the questions before we let them go with the device and the app to make sure that any obvious questions they have immediately they can ask. And so that's something we do to try to minimize these kinds of problems with understanding the questions.
And for me, I think the most important thing is to think clearly about what you are actually trying to study, right? Because something that I noticed that's very common in EMA research is that a lot of researchers just use the concept that's been studied quite often in cross-sectional research and think it might be something that varies over time, which sometimes is true, right? But then the immediate follow-up that I see also very often is that they use the same measurement that is used in cross-sectional research and directly put it in the EMA research. And that could sometimes be problematic because sometimes the time scale is implied in the item, how you phrase them, right? But in the EMA research, of course, you have a completely different time scale compared to what you're interested in a cross-sectional research. Then you really need to make it explicit, but still make it make sense. And that for me is quite challenging. And what I think is a practical way of dealing with this is really that just piloting it a lot, first on yourself, try to see how you would feel about these measurements as a participant. Do they make sense to you? Do you feel that your experience with these items do vary over time? If not, then maybe now you see that it's not something very meaningful to measure in an EMA setting. And also pilot it with other people. Try to ask them how they approach and understand the same item and see if they do understand it in the same way as you do. And then that would give you some indications on how clearly formulated this item is in your study.
I really like
Sound
that
like great
approach.
tips.
I think it's a great idea to first start with yourself and your colleagues before you waste real participants' time with problems that might be very obvious. I think it's a super great approach.
Yeah, sounds great. And also because we've talked about missingness, and you already brought up some really interesting ways of maybe starting to manage missingness or maybe improving future designs as well. But I was wondering, do you have any other tips as well for how to deal with it? Maybe to do with incentive schedules or providing personalized visualizations of participants' data or something like that?
So in my experience from the data collection that I have seen with my own eyes, what is really important is that you try to build good rapport with your participants. Because a lot of the times the participants came to the study with different goals, right? But mostly they are trying to use this to track something over time to see if there is any progress, right? Then if you make them feel like you are in this together with them and you, in a sense, are witnessing this growth of them with them, then it really makes their motivation a bit stronger in participating in this study, right? Because the study that I mentioned just earlier, the response process study in Tilburg University, it was quite intense because it was 5 beeps per day for a whole month. And then within each beep, they need to answer this one open text or voice recording question to one of the response process for an emotion item. It's not an easy study, but on average, this study achieved a compliance of more than 90%. And what I think they did really well is by having these moments where they sit down and talk, either it's onboarding, briefing, or in the middle cognitive interviews, that this nice dynamics between participants and researchers is formed instead of two distant strangers who are just trying to get what they want from each other. So in a sense, this makes the willingness of participating a bit stronger. And another perspective that's probably a bit more pragmatic is about incentives, of course. Like Olga just mentioned, maybe it's nice to provide some personalized feedback report for the participants to better see their progress, right? But what's interesting for me is that there is a recent preprint by Mila Pichler-Yameki, also from KU Leuven in Belgium. So she actually studied this effect of different incentives on people's compliance and also on the data quality. And what she found is that in a university student sample, what does the best in terms of achieving high compliance is actually payment per beep. So the more you fill out, the more payment you get in the end, compared to two other schemes, which is fixed payment and fixed payment plus a feedback report. So this is also a bit shocking for me, right? Because this additional feedback report did not really lead to higher compliance than money per beep. So maybe it depends on what the participants wanted from the beginning of the study, right? Some might just did not care about this report or were already capable of tracking their own progress regardless of the report. The particular reason we don't know, but I think this is an interesting study to show that maybe this general incentive of payment, incremental payment per beep could be a nice way to go from now on.
I think it also really depends on your population. So this preprint, I think with university students, you said, which might not be as intrinsically motivated to get as much info out of this, but they might be very motivated to get as much money out of this. But we often work with patient samples, and they tend to be very highly motivated to get insights into their own symptoms. So there, I think maybe this could work better, but I don't have references to back this up. This is just intuition. But we also often work, not yes, but we also often work with these incremental payments with a compliance rate higher than so much gets the full payment, and anything else gets a bit less. And this also has worked relatively well for us.
Right. So many creative approaches to make EMA studies more fun and also more informative for us as researchers, right? I think it's always a good idea to keep the participant in mind and try to see it from their perspective. In the interest of time, are there any last things you want to mention?
I think one of the main things that I really would recommend any researcher to do, and even anyone that's maybe not a researcher but just interested in this kind of stuff, is to conduct your own little EMA with yourself as a participant, because it really is, it can be very intense, but it also doesn't have to be. You can also do it once per day, for example. It's already longitudinal, and you can see a lot of patterns, or twice per day, depending on what you're interested in. And I think many of us probably have specific behaviors or specific things in their lives that they would benefit from understanding better, or might want to understand better. And it does give you a lot of insights also in how a participant would perceive this. And there are some apps available where you can do this for free. So we can maybe link those in the description. Yeah. I think that's my main thing to suggest.
Yeah, that's a very nice idea. Good homework for everyone. Try this out themselves and experience time-varying constructs themselves. All right, then I would say let's close it at this, and thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, all of you.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much.